Jacob Carter and his nephew Trevor, driving back from their fishing trip, reached the edge of the small Mississippi town just as the sun began to set. The horizon was painted in hues of orange and red, but the peaceful scene was disrupted by the flashing lights of a police cruiser pulling them over. "Stay calm, Trevor," Jacob said as he guided the truck to the side of the narrow two-lane road. His voice carried the discipline of a Marine veteran, but even he couldn't ignore the tension in his chest. Small-town police stops could sometimes take on an edge he wasn't eager to confront. As the officer approached, Jacob rolled down the window. The man was tall, white, and bore an expression of authority seasoned with suspicion. His hand lingered near his holster as he leaned down to meet Jacob's calm gaze. "Evening, officer. Is there a problem?" Jacob asked, his voice even. "License and registration," the officer said curtly. His name tag read Hollister. There was no greeting or explanation, just a scrutinizing glare that lingered a little too long on Jacob's dark skin. Jacob handed over the requested documents without hesitation, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. Trevor, just 17 and clearly nervous, fidgeted in the passenger seat. "Where are you coming from?" Hollister asked, his tone sharp. "Fishing trip. Up at Lake Darnell," Jacob replied, nodding toward the bed of the truck, where their gear was neatly packed alongside a small cooler of fish. The officer glanced back, shining his flashlight over the gear. "Fishing, huh? You sure about that?" Jacob tensed but kept his expression neutral. "Yes, sir." "Is there a reason for this stop?" Hollister ignored the question. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his hand now resting openly on his gun. "Excuse me?" Jacob asked, his voice calm but firm. "I said, step out of the vehicle," Hollister repeated. "Now." Jacob exchanged a glance with Trevor. "Stay put," he said quietly before stepping out of the truck. As soon as his boots hit the asphalt, Hollister grabbed his arm, spinning him around to face the vehicle. "Hey!" Trevor shouted, starting to open his door, but Hollister shot him a warning glare. "Stay in the truck, kid, unless you want trouble." Jacob didn't resist as Hollister patted him down, though his patience was wearing thin. "Officer, if you could explain." "Shut it," Hollister snapped. "We've had reports of a suspicious vehicle in the area, matching this description." Jacob took a deep breath. "Suspicious how?" "That's none of your concern," Hollister retorted. He pulled out his radio and called for backup, his tone making it clear that he was treating this as a dangerous situation. Minutes later, another cruiser arrived, its lights flashing. Two more officers stepped out, one a younger man who looked uncertain, the other an older officer who approached with the same air of hostility as Hollister. "Hands on the hood," the older officer barked. Trevor, unable to stay silent any longer, shouted, "This is insane. We didn't do anything." "Step out of the vehicle," the older officer demanded. Slowly, terrified but defiant, Trevor climbed out. The younger officer stepped forward, his hand twitching near his belt. "Let's not make this harder than it has to be," he said, though his voice betrayed a hint of doubt. Jacob turned his head slightly. "Trevor, do as they say." Trevor obeyed, but the anger in his eyes was evident. "You're treating us like criminals for no reason," he shouted as the older officer patted him down roughly. The search of the vehicle followed, with the officers dumping out the cooler and rifling through their gear. Hollister pulled out Jacob's military ID and scoffed. "A Marine, huh? Bet you think that makes you untouchable?" Jacob's fists clenched at his sides, but he kept his voice steady. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor." "Not happening," Hollister sneered. The humiliation escalated as they were both cuffed and placed in the back of the police car without explanation. The townsfolk began gathering nearby, some whispering, others openly staring. A few took out their phones, recording the scene. "You see this?" Trevor muttered, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and fury. "They're treating us like this because of the color of our skin." Jacob didn't respond. He was too busy calculating their next move, knowing that any misstep could make a bad situation even worse. After what felt like an eternity, a woman approached the scene, a black attorney from out of town who happened to be driving by and noticed the commotion. She introduced herself firmly, demanding to know why the men were being detained. Hollister's demeanor faltered slightly, but he doubled down. We have reason to believe they're involved in illegal activity. The attorney pressed for specifics, her presence adding a layer of accountability the officers hadn't anticipated. When none of their claims held up to scrutiny, they begrudgingly released Jacob and Trevor, though not without a final warning. "Y'all are lucky this time," Hollister spat as he uncuffed them. "But don't think for a second that you're off my radar." Jacob and Trevor climbed back into their truck, shaken but relieved to be free. As they drove away, Trevor looked over at his uncle. "What do we do now?" Jacob's grip tightened on the wheel. "We fight this," he said quietly. "Not just for us, but for every other person they've done this to." Their fishing trip had been a quiet escape from the world. Now, it was a rallying point for justice. Jacob and Trevor hadn't made it far down the road before another set of flashing lights appeared in their rearview mirror. The tension from their last encounter with Officer Hollister still clung to them like a storm cloud, but now it was two different officers pulling them over. Jacob sighed, slowing the truck to a stop. "Stay calm, Trevor," he said, more for himself than for his nephew. As Jacob rolled down the window, two officers approached. The first, Officer Grant, was burly with a square jaw and an aggressive swagger. His partner, Officer Smith, was wiry and moved with the deliberate calculation of a predator sizing up its prey. Jacob noticed their cold, assessing eyes as they approached the vehicle. "License and registration?" Grant demanded without preamble. Jacob handed over his documents, careful not to make any sudden movements. "Evening, officers. Can I ask what this is about?" "Your taillight's out," Smith said, his voice smooth but dripping with insincerity. Jacob glanced in his side mirror and immediately knew it was a lie. He'd checked his lights before leaving for the fishing trip. Everything had been in perfect working order. He opened his mouth to protest but caught himself, knowing it wouldn't help. Trevor, however, wasn't as measured. "The taillight's not out," he said, his voice laced with defiance. "We checked before we left." Grant's eyes flicked to Trevor, and his expression hardened. "Kid, you got something you want to say to me?" Trevor froze under the officer's glare, but Jacob quickly interjected. "My nephew didn't mean any disrespect, officer. We're just trying to get home." Smith smirked and leaned closer to the window. "Mind if we take a look around your vehicle?" "Standard procedure." Jacob knew he could refuse, but he also knew where that would lead. "Go ahead," he said evenly. Grant yanked open the driver's side door. "Step out of the vehicle." Jacob complied, his heart pounding as he climbed out. Grant immediately turned him around, pressing him against the side of the truck with more force than necessary. "Is this really necessary?" Jacob asked, his voice strained. "Quiet," Grant barked, patting Jacob down roughly. When his search turned up nothing, he gestured for Trevor to step out. "Your turn." Trevor hesitated, but a sharp look from Jacob made him comply. As Trevor stepped out, Smith took over, frisking him with exaggerated thoroughness, even lifting his shirt and inspecting his waistband as if expecting to find contraband. "Man, this is ridiculous," Trevor muttered. Grant rounded on him, towering over the teenager. "You got a problem, boy?" The word hung in the air like a slap. Trevor's fists clenched, but Jacob stepped between them, his voice calm but firm. "We're cooperating, officer. No need for hostility." "Hostility?" Smith sneered, circling the truck. "We're doing our job. Maybe you'd prefer it if we didn't and let folks like you get away with whatever you want." Jacob's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay silent. He watched as Smith began rifling through the truck, tossing their gear onto the ground carelessly. The cooler, still filled with their catch from the lake, was upended, its contents spilling onto the dusty roadside. "Come on, man," Trevor exclaimed, unable to hold back any longer. "That's our stuff." "Shut your mouth," Grant snapped, stepping closer to Trevor again. "You think you can talk back to me? You don't get to talk." Jacob could feel the humiliation simmering into anger, but he placed a steadying hand on Trevor's shoulder. "Let it go," he murmured. Smith emerged from the truck, holding a small tackle box as if it were evidence of a crime. "What's in here?" he asked, though it was clear he already knew. He popped it open, revealing nothing but fishing hooks and lures. "Fishing gear," Jacob replied, his tone clipped. Smith tossed the box onto the ground, scattering its contents. Looks suspicious to me. Trevor couldn't contain himself any longer. Suspicious? It's a damn tackle box. What's wrong with you? The sharp crack of Grant's palm against Trevor's chest silenced him instantly. Watch your tone, boy, Grant growled, his voice low and menacing. You're lucky we don't haul you in for obstruction. That's enough, Jacob said sharply, stepping between them again. His patience had finally worn thin. You've searched us, you've searched the truck. We haven't done anything wrong and you know it. Grant's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, it looked like he might lash out. But then he smiled coldly. You're free to go. For now. Smith joined him, his smirk still in place. But we'll be watching. Wouldn't want you folks causing any trouble. Jacob and Trevor climbed back into the truck, their dignity in tatters but their resolve intact. As they drove away, the officers' laughter echoed behind them, a cruel reminder of their power. Trevor stared out the window, his hands trembling with anger. Why do they treat us like this? Like we're less than human? Jacob didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Because they can, he said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of experience. But we won't let them win. Not tonight. As the small town disappeared in their rearview mirror, Jacob silently vowed that this would not be the end of the story. As Jacob drove on in silence, the darkness of the Mississippi backroads seemed to close in around them. Trevor sat rigid in the passenger seat, his jaw clenched, his fists balled in his lap. The boy's frustration was palpable, but Jacob's calm demeanor remained steadfast, a reflection of years spent defusing volatile situations. Why didn't you stand up to them more? Trevor blurted out finally, unable to contain himself. They treated us like garbage. Like we're criminals just because of how we look. Jacob kept his eyes on the road. Standing up doesn't always mean yelling back. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is keep your cool. Trevor shook his head, his voice rising. But they disrespected you. They disrespected us. What's the point of staying calm if they just get away with it? They didn't break us, did they? Jacob replied evenly, glancing at his nephew. That's the point. Trevor opened his mouth to argue, but the distant glow of flashing lights caught both their attention. Jacob's heart sank. A familiar dread settled in his chest as the lights grew brighter, closer. They're pulling us over again, Trevor said, panic creeping into his voice. Jacob slowed the truck, easing it onto the shoulder. His jaw tightened as he took a steadying breath. Stay calm. Hands on the dash, just like before. The cruiser's headlights lit up the cab as two officers approached. Jacob recognized one immediately, Officer Hollister. The other was a heavy-set man with a shaved head, his badge gleaming under the harsh lights. They moved with the confidence of men who knew they had power and weren't afraid to wield it. Out of the truck, Hollister barked as he reached Jacob's window, rapping on the glass with his flashlight. Jacob hesitated for a split second, then opened the door and stepped out. Trevor followed, his movements stiff with fear. Hands where I can see them, the other officer growled. No sudden moves. Jacob raised his hands, his expression impassive. What seems to be the problem, officer? Hollister smirked. Got a call about a vehicle matching this description. Something about suspicious activity near the old mill. Trevor shot Jacob a bewildered look. What? We haven't even been near. Quiet. Hollister snapped, stepping toward the boy. Did I say you could talk, boy? Jacob stepped between them, his hands still raised. He's just a kid. No need to get aggressive. The heavy-set officer sneered. A kid who needs to learn some respect. Maybe we'll take him in, let him cool off in a cell for a while. That won't be necessary, Jacob said firmly, his voice calm but unyielding. Hollister circled Jacob slowly, the flashlight beam dancing across his face. You got quite the mouth on you, Marine. Bet you think you're better than us, don't you? All that training, all that discipline. Jacob didn't rise to the bait. Just trying to get home, officer. Well, maybe we don't want you going anywhere just yet, Hollister said, stepping closer. His tone was low, menacing. Maybe we got some questions for you. Trevor's fists clenched, and he took a step forward. This is harassment. You're only doing this because... Trevor, Stop, Jacob said sharply. But the boy's anger boiled over. No, Uncle Jake. They're doing this because we're black. They're just looking for an excuse to mess with us. Hollister's smirk widened. Is that what you think, kid? That we're picking on you? Maybe you're the ones looking for trouble. Jacob placed a hand on Trevor's shoulder, squeezing it gently. Let me handle this, he said quietly. He turned back to the officers. You've searched us, you've searched the truck. We haven't done anything wrong. You know that? The heavy-set officer stepped forward, his face inches from Jacob's. You don't tell us how to do our job. Out here, we decide what's wrong. Hollister chuckled, leaning against the truck as if settling in for a show. Maybe we take a look through that truck again. Could be you're hiding something we missed. Trevor's voice trembled with rage. You already tore through our stuff. What more do you want? Hollister pushed off the truck and strode toward Trevor. What I want is for you to shut your mouth and do as you're told. Jacob stepped in front of Trevor, his calm veneer starting to crack. That's enough. You've got no reason to detain us. Either charge us or let us go. Hollister's smirk disappeared. He stared at Jacob for a long moment, then nodded to his partner. What? Trevor exclaimed, panic flashing across his face. You can't do this. The heavy-set officer grabbed Trevor's arm, yanking it behind his back. Jacob didn't resist as Hollister slapped the cuffs on him, but his eyes burned with restrained fury. The townsfolk began gathering again, drawn by the commotion. Whispers spread through the crowd, some sympathetic, others judgmental. A few pulled out their phones, recording the scene. You're making a mistake, Jacob said, his voice low and controlled. This won't end the way you think it will. Hollister laughed. Oh, I think it'll end just fine. As they were shoved into the back of the cruiser, Trevor's voice shook with emotion. Uncle Jake, what do we do now? Jacob met his nephew's eyes, his own filled with quiet determination. We stay strong. And we make sure the truth comes out. The cruiser pulled away, leaving the gathered crowd and the spilled contents of their truck behind. The night closed in once more, but Jacob's resolve burned brighter than ever. The police cruiser bumped along the uneven road as Jacob and Trevor sat in the back seat, their wrists restrained by cold, tight cuffs. The silence in the cab was punctuated only by the crackle of the police radio. Officer Hollister and his partner, Officer Grant, exchanged glances in the front seat, a smug air of authority radiating from them. Trevor's breaths were shallow, his face pale under the harsh glow of the dashboard lights. He whispered, Uncle Jake, why are they doing this? We didn't do anything. Jacob leaned closer to the boy, his voice calm and steady. They want a reaction, Trevor. Don't give it to them. Just keep your head up. Hollister glanced at them through the rearview mirror, his smirk reflected in the glass. Big talk from the Marine. But let's see how calm you stay when we get to the station. Grant chuckled darkly. Yeah, bet he's used to playing the hero. Not so easy when you're on the other side of the bars. They pulled into the gravel parking lot of the small-town police station, the building dimly lit and imposing. Hollister parked the cruiser, and the two officers dragged Jacob and Trevor out of the back seat. Gravel crunched underfoot as they were led inside, the fluorescent lights of the station buzzing faintly overhead. The booking room smelled of stale coffee and sweat. A worn wooden desk sat in the center, cluttered with paperwork and empty styrofoam cups. Officer Smith, the wiry man who had joined them earlier, was waiting with an eager expression. About time, Smith said. I've got some questions for the kid. Trevor stiffened, his wide eyes darting toward Jacob. Jacob stepped forward instinctively, his broad shoulders squaring. If you've got questions, you'll be asking me. He's a minor. Hollister laughed, clapping Jacob on the shoulder with exaggerated friendliness. Relax, Marine. We're just having a little chat. Nothing for you to worry about. Jacob didn't flinch, his calm exterior unshaken. He's 17. You're not questioning him without a guardian or a lawyer present. Smith smirked and crossed his arms. You think you're in a position to make demands? You're both suspects. And the kid's old enough to answer a few questions? Trevor looked at Jacob, panic flashing in his eyes. Uncle Jake? It's okay, Jacob said firmly, locking eyes with his nephew. You don't have to say anything. Quiet, Grant barked, stepping closer. You don't tell us how to do our job. Jacob remained steady, his gaze never wavering. I'm telling you the law. You want to talk to him, you go through me. Smith sneered, grabbing a metal chair and dragging it across the room with a screech. He plopped it in front of Trevor and gestured for the boy to sit. We'll see how tough you are when we get the truth out of this one. Jacob moved to block them, but Hollister shoved him back roughly. Sit down and shut up, Carter. Or I'll add obstruction to the charges. Trevor hesitated, his legs trembling as Smith loomed over him. So, kid, Smith began, leaning in close. What were you two really doing out there tonight? Don't think I didn't see you squirming back in the truck. We were fishing. Trevor blurted out, his voice cracking. That's it. We weren't doing anything wrong. Smith snorted, circling the boy like a predator. Fishing, huh? Funny how we keep getting reports about suspicious vehicles in the area. Maybe you two were up to something else. Stealing, trespassing, maybe worse. We didn't do anything. Trevor cried, his voice rising in desperation. That's enough, Jacob said sharply, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. He stood, his bound hands still in front of him. You're not intimidating him. This stops now. Grant grabbed Jacob by the shoulder, shoving him back down into the chair. You don't call the shots here, Carter. You're just another suspect. Jacob glared up at him, his voice steady. You can't threaten a kid to cover for your lack of evidence. You know you've got nothing. Smith ignored him, turning back to Trevor. Come on, kid. Be smart. You tell us the truth and maybe we go easy on you. Otherwise, you'll both be spending the night in a cell. Trevor's eyes brimmed with tears as he looked helplessly at Jacob. I'm telling the truth. We were just fishing. That's all we were doing. Sure, Smith said mockingly. He slammed his hands on the desk, making Trevor flinch. And I suppose you've got no problem explaining why you were acting so nervous? Because you're scaring him. Jacob snapped, his voice rising for the first time. Because you dragged a kid into a police station with no cause and started hurling accusations? Hollister stepped forward, his face inches from Jacob's. You keep running that mouth, Marine, and you'll regret it. You think your military service makes you untouchable? Out here, you're just another loudmouth. Jacob stared back, his expression unwavering. I've dealt with worse men than you, officer. And I didn't break then either. The tension in the room was suffocating. Even Smith faltered, his smug grin fading as he glanced at Hollister. Grant cleared his throat, breaking the silence. Enough of this. Lock them up. Let them stew for a while. Trevor's face crumpled, but Jacob placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder as they were led toward the holding cells. Remember what I said, Trevor, Jacob whispered. Keep your head up. This isn't over. As the heavy metal door slammed shut behind them, Jacob sat on the cold bench beside Trevor, his presence a steady anchor in the storm. Despite the humiliation, despite the fear etched into his nephew's face, Jacob's resolve remained unbroken. They hadn't won yet, but Jacob knew this was far from the end. The cold cell was oppressive, the flickering fluorescent light above casting harsh shadows on the stained concrete walls. Jacob sat on the narrow bench, his calm demeanor hiding the storm brewing inside him. Trevor sat next to him, his legs bouncing anxiously. Despite his uncle's reassuring presence, the boy was rattled, his youthful energy now tainted by fear. Uncle Jake, Trevor whispered, glancing nervously toward the bars. What if they try something? They're not gonna just let us go. They'll push as far as they think they can, Jacob replied evenly, his voice low and measured. But we don't give them an inch. Let them make the mistakes. Trevor swallowed hard and nodded. His trembling hand reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. He opened the camera app and discreetly began recording, tilting the device just enough to capture the cell door and the room beyond. Not long after, the sound of heavy boots echoed down the hallway. Officer Hollister and Grant appeared, their faces twisted into expressions of smug authority. Hollister banged a baton against the bars, making Trevor flinch. On your feet, Hollister ordered. Both of you. Jacob stood slowly, his tall, solid frame making the cramped cell feel even smaller. Trevor followed his lead, slipping the phone into his jacket pocket but keeping the camera rolling. What now? Jacob asked, his tone neutral but firm. Hollister smirked, pulling a set of keys from his belt. We're gonna have a little chat in the interrogation room. Maybe do a more thorough search. Never know what you might be hiding. Jacob's jaw tightened, but he forced his expression to remain calm. We've already been searched. You didn't find anything. Grant chuckled. Maybe we didn't look hard enough. Trevor's voice wavered as he spoke up. You can't just keep doing this. You have no reason. Hollister cut him off with a sharp glare. Kid, you're lucky we're not tossing you in juvie. Now shut your mouth and do as you're told. Jacob stepped slightly in front of Trevor, shielding him. Whatever you're planning, it ends now. You've already crossed the line. Hollister's smirk faded, replaced by a scowl. You think you're in charge here? That's cute. Grant unlocked the cell door and gestured for them to step out. Let's go. Unless you want us to drag you. Jacob hesitated, his instincts screaming that this was a setup. But he knew resisting would only escalate the situation. Trevor, stay close to me. They were led down a narrow corridor to a small, windowless room. A single metal table with 2 chairs stood under a buzzing fluorescent light. Hollister motioned for them to sit, but Jacob remained standing. You want something from us, you're gonna need to explain yourself first, Jacob said, his voice calm but edged with steel. Hollister's eyes narrowed. Sit down. Jacob didn't move. Not until you tell me why we're here. You've got no charges, no evidence, and no justification. This stops here. Grant stepped forward, his hand hovering near his baton. You think you're tough, Carter? Let's see how tough you are when we start digging. Trevor, still standing behind Jacob, adjusted his jacket pocket, ensuring the phone's camera was aimed at the scene. He could feel his pulse racing, but he kept his movements slow and subtle. Hollister leaned closer to Jacob, his voice low and menacing. You think your Marine training makes you special? Out here, you're nothing. Just another loudmouth who doesn't know when to shut up. Jacob's eyes locked onto Hollister's, unflinching. I know exactly what I am. And I know exactly what you're doing. You think you can intimidate us, but all you're doing is digging yourself a deeper hole. Hollister's lips twisted into a sneer. We'll see about that. He turned to Grant. Search him again. Grant reached for Jacob's arm, but Jacob stepped back, his movements smooth and controlled. You've already searched me. Anything more is illegal, and you know it. Is that so? Grant taunted, his grip tightening on his baton. You planning to stop us? Jacob's muscles tensed, but he held his ground, refusing to rise to the provocation. I'm planning to hold you accountable. Everything you've done tonight has been harassment. And now it's on record? Trevor's voice broke through the tension. Yeah, it is. Hollister spun around, his eyes narrowing as he spotted the phone's camera peeking from Trevor's pocket. What the hell is that? Trevor's confidence wavered, but Jacob's voice cut through like a blade. It's evidence. Evidence of every unlawful thing you've done tonight. Grant lunged toward Trevor, but Jacob stepped between them, his voice booming. Enough. You lay a hand on him, and I'll make sure this goes straight to the FBI. The room fell into a tense silence, the officers visibly bristling under Jacob's unyielding presence. Hollister's face twisted in frustration, but he held back, clearly calculating his next move. You think this little video's gonna save you? Hollister sneered. No one's gonna believe a couple of troublemakers like you. Jacob's expression didn't waver. We don't need them to believe us. We just need the truth to come out. And trust me, it will. Hollister hesitated, his confidence shaken for the first time. He exchanged a glance with Grant, who looked equally unsure. The power dynamic in the room had shifted, and they knew it. Finally, Hollister spat out a curse and stormed toward the door. Put them back in the cell. Let them rot. Grant followed, muttering under his breath. They shoved Jacob and Trevor back down the corridor, slamming the cell door behind them. Trevor let out a shaky breath as he pulled out the phone, stopping the recording. Did we win? Jacob sat back down on the bench, his calm demeanor returning. We're still in here, so no. But we've got what we need. Now we wait. Trevor looked at the phone in his hands, a flicker of hope lighting up his frightened eyes. For the first time that night, he felt like they had a chance. And he knew his uncle wouldn't stop until justice was served. The cell was quiet, but the atmosphere buzzed with unspoken tension. Jacob sat on the cold bench, his composure unbroken despite the chaos of the night. Trevor sat beside him, gripping his phone tightly. The young man was trying to process what had just happened, but the weight of fear and adrenaline left him feeling hollow. "Uncle Jake," Trevor whispered, his voice barely audible. "Do you think they'll come after us for recording?" Jacob glanced at his nephew, his expression calm but stern. "They're already nervous, Trevor. That's why they tried so hard to scare us in that room. They know they crossed a line." Trevor nodded, his grip on the phone tightening. "What if they try to delete it?" "They won't get the chance," Jacob replied, his voice steady. "You keep that phone close and we don't let them see us flinch. Fear's their weapon, but they've lost control of the fight." The sound of heavy boots echoed through the hallway again. Trevor's heart skipped a beat as Officer Hollister appeared, flanked by Grant and Smith. Their expressions were dark, their previous smugness replaced by something colder, something closer to fear. Hollister stopped in front of the cell, gripping the bars tightly. "You think you're real smart, don't you?" His tone was sharp, cutting through the tense air. Jacob stood, his imposing frame making the already narrow cell feel even smaller. "I don't need to be smart to know right from wrong. But you've made sure we've got plenty to work with?" Smith sneered but said nothing, his eyes darting to Trevor's phone. "You think that little video changes anything?" Hollister pressed. "It's your word against ours." Jacob stepped closer to the bars, his calm voice carrying a weight that made even Hollister flinch. "You can try to twist this, bury it, or lie about it, but that video is the truth. It shows everything, your threats, your harassment, the way you tried to intimidate a kid. And the truth has a way of coming out." Grant, who had been silent, shifted uncomfortably. "You're making this a lot bigger than it needs to be, Carter. Maybe we can talk this out." Jacob's sharp gaze snapped to him. "Talk? Now you want to talk? After everything you've put us through tonight?" Grant hesitated, glancing at Hollister for guidance, but Hollister's bravado had dimmed. "We were just doing our job," he said defensively, though the crack in his voice betrayed him. Jacob shook his head, his voice rising slightly. "Your job? Was your job to stop us for no reason? To search us, humiliate us, and lock us up without cause? Or was your job to uphold the law?" Trevor's confidence grew as he watched his uncle dismantle their authority with words alone. He pulled the phone from his pocket, holding it in plain view. "This video's going viral if we don't get out of here," Trevor said, his voice trembling but firm. Hollister's face darkened. "You think you can threaten us with that?" He took a step closer to the bars, his tone low and venomous. "You don't know how things work around here." Jacob stepped between Hollister and Trevor, his broad shoulders blocking the officer's view of the boy. "No, Officer Hollister," Jacob said, his voice as cold as steel. "You don't know how things work now. That video is proof. Proof that your power doesn't protect you from accountability. And whether it's tonight or tomorrow, people are going to see who you really are." Hollister's hand twitched toward his belt, but he stopped himself, realizing how every move he made was under scrutiny. Smith leaned closer, his voice dripping with condescension. "You think anyone's gonna believe you? This is our town. People trust us, not a couple of outsiders causing trouble." Jacob's laugh was low and humorless. "Trust is earned, officer. And from what I've seen, yours is running on fumes." The door at the end of the hallway opened suddenly, and a man in a crisp uniform walked in. His presence demanded attention, his gold badge gleaming under the harsh lights. The name on his tag read Chief Rollins. "What's going on here?" Rollins asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Hollister stiffened, his bravado faltering. "Chief, we've got a couple of troublemakers." Rollins raised a hand, cutting him off. "I've been getting calls, Hollister. Complaints about harassment, excessive force, and a whole lot of nonsense I shouldn't be hearing about my officers. Care to explain?" Hollister opened his mouth to speak, but Jacob stepped forward, his voice steady and clear. "Chief Rollins, I'm Jacob Carter. This is my nephew, Trevor. We've been detained, harassed, and threatened without cause. And we have proof." Trevor stepped forward, holding up the phone. "It's all here, sir. Everything they did to us." Rollins' sharp eyes darted between the phone and his officers. Hollister and Grant exchanged nervous glances, their confidence crumbling. "Let me see that," Rollins said, extending a hand toward Trevor. Trevor hesitated, but Jacob gave him a small nod. "Show him," Jacob said quietly. Trevor handed over the phone, and Rollins watched the video in silence. The room grew heavy with tension as every threat, every insult, and every act of intimidation played out on the small screen. When the video ended, Rollins handed the phone back to Trevor. His expression was unreadable, but his next words were clear and firm. "Hollister, Grant, Smith, my office." "No." "But Chief," Hollister began, but Rollins silenced him with a glare. "No." The three officers shuffled out, their arrogance replaced by quiet panic. Rollins turned back to Jacob and Trevor, his tone measured. "I'll be reviewing this video thoroughly. In the meantime, you're free to go. I'll make sure your belongings are returned." Trevor exhaled shakily as Jacob placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Thank you, Chief," Jacob said, his voice steady. "But this doesn't end here." Rollins met his gaze, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "No, it doesn't," he replied. "And it won't?" As Jacob and Trevor were escorted back to the booking room, the air was thick with tension. Officer Hollister, Grant, and Smith disappeared into Chief Rollins' office, their hurried steps echoing down the hallway. For a moment, the station was quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint crackle of a police radio in the background. Trevor clutched his phone tightly, still shaken but visibly relieved that the video had begun to shift the balance of power. Jacob's calm demeanor remained unchanged, though his eyes were sharp, watching every movement in the room. The silence was broken by the sound of tires screeching into the parking lot. Moments later, the heavy metal door creaked open, and 3 more officers entered the station. Among them was Lieutenant Harris, a tall, broad-shouldered black man whose authoritative presence immediately filled the room. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished to a shine, and his sharp gaze swept over the scene like a hawk assessing a battlefield. "What's going on here?" Harris asked, his deep voice steady but firm. His eyes landed on Jacob and Trevor, taking in their disheveled appearance and the clear distress on Trevor's face. "Lieutenant Harris," Chief Rollins said, emerging from his office with a weary expression. "Glad you're here. We've got a situation." Jacob stepped forward, his composure as resolute as ever. "Lieutenant, I'm Jacob Carter, a former Marine. This is my nephew, Trevor. We've been detained and harassed without cause by your officers, and we have video evidence to prove it." Harris's eyes narrowed as he took in Jacob's words. He nodded slowly. "Let me see the video." Trevor hesitated for a moment, his fingers tightening around the phone. Jacob placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's okay, Trevor. Show him." Trevor unlocked the phone and handed it to Harris. The lieutenant's expression remained stoic as he began watching the footage. The room was silent, every officer present stealing glances at Harris to gauge his reaction. As the video played, Harris's jaw tightened. He let out a slow breath, his face hardening with each passing second. The recording captured every moment: Hollister's sneering threats, the unnecessary searches, the aggressive questioning, and the humiliation they had endured. When the video ended, Harris handed the phone back to Trevor and turned to Chief Rollins. "We need to talk," he said simply, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the room. "Agreed," Rollins replied, gesturing for Harris to follow him into his office. Before Harris turned to leave, he looked directly at Jacob. "Stay here. I'll be back." As the 2 senior officers disappeared behind the office door, Jacob and Trevor were left alone with the remaining officers. Some shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact, while others watched with thinly veiled disdain. The tension was palpable. "Uncle Jake," Trevor whispered, his voice trembling. "Do you think he's on our side?" Jacob didn't take his eyes off the office door. "Harris is a professional. He'll do what's right." Minutes stretched into what felt like hours before Harris and Rollins emerged. Harris's face was set in a grim expression, while Rollins looked visibly uneasy. Harris stepped forward, addressing the room. "I've reviewed the video, and it's clear that lines were crossed tonight. Mr. Carter and his nephew were subjected to unacceptable behavior by our officers. This will be addressed immediately. Trevor let out a shaky sigh of relief, but Harris wasn't finished. His sharp gaze turned to the remaining officers in the room. Where are Officers Hollister, Grant, and Smith? They're in the break room, one of the younger officers mumbled. Harris nodded curtly. Bring them here. The younger officer scurried off, returning moments later with the 3 disgraced officers in tow. Hollister's face was a mask of barely contained anger, Grant's shoulders were hunched, and Smith's usual smirk was replaced with a scowl. Lieutenant Harris, Hollister began, his voice dripping with false confidence. This is all a misunderstanding. That video doesn't show the whole story. Enough, Harris cut him off, his voice like a whip. I've seen enough to know that your actions tonight were unprofessional, unethical, and in violation of department policy. You've disgraced this uniform and this station. Hollister's face flushed red. With all due respect, sir, these people? These people? Harris repeated, his voice dangerously low. Care to finish that sentence, officer? Hollister's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Harris took a step closer, towering over him. Your behavior reflects poorly not only on you but on every officer who wears this badge. You think you can abuse your power without consequences? You think no one's watching? Guess what? People are always watching, Hollister. And now we have proof. Grant shifted uncomfortably, muttering under his breath, "This is ridiculous. They're just looking for trouble." Harris turned his piercing gaze on Grant. You call what you did tonight just doing your job? Intimidating a child? Violating the rights of a Marine who's done more for this country than you ever will? If that's your idea of policing, then you don't belong here. Smith crossed his arms, his expression defiant. What are you going to do about it? Harris's eyes darkened. Oh, you'll find out soon enough. Turning back to Jacob, Harris's tone softened slightly. Mr. Carter, I'm deeply sorry for what you and your nephew have been through tonight. This should never have happened. Jacob nodded, his voice calm but resolute. Apologies are a start, Lieutenant. But we both know words aren't enough. You're right, Harris said. This isn't the end. I'll make sure there's a full investigation, and appropriate action will be taken. Trevor finally spoke up, his voice small but determined. Will they lose their jobs? Harris looked at the boy, his expression softening further. That's not for me to decide, but I'll make sure they're held accountable. As the officers escorted Jacob and Trevor out of the station, Hollister's glare burned into their backs. But for the first time that night, Jacob felt a glimmer of hope. The truth was out, and there was no turning back.